Scotland spent years and millions of pounds trying to bring a dead river back to life. They hired engineers, brought in heavy machinery, moved rocks, redirected water, nothing worked. The river stayed broken. The fish never came back. The land around it kept dying. Then in 2002, 11 beavers were quietly released into the Scottish countryside. Nobody announced it. No press conference, no government approval, just 11 animals. Dropped into a landscape they hadn't touched in over 400 years. Within months, something started happening along that river, something the engineers hadn't planned for. Something the scientists hadn't predicted. The water slowed, the ground changed. And a river that machinery couldn't fix started to heal itself. What those 11 beavers did next shocked the researchers watching them. It changed how Scotland thinks about rivers. And it quietly rewrote the rules of ecological restoration across Europe. This is that story. To understand what the beavers did, you first have to understand what Scotland lost. For centuries, the River Tay Basin in Perthshire was a live salmon so thick in the water, farmers used them as fertilizer. Otters along every bank, insects, birds, wildflowers crowding the edges. The kind of river that felt endless. Then came the drainage projects, the agricultural expansion, the flood control schemes of the 20th century. Engineers straightened the river, removed the natural bends, cleared the fallen trees that used to slow the water down. It seemed logical at the time. Faster water, better drainage, less flooding for the farms nearby, but nature doesn't work that way. When you straighten a river, you kill it. The water moved too fast. It stopped depositing the sediment that builds riverbanks. Banks collapsed. The wetlands dried out. The salmon lost their breeding grounds. By the 1990s, large stretches of what had once been thriving river habitat were essentially dead channels, just water moving through damaged land. The Scottish government spent heavily trying to fix it. Restoration crews moved in. They dropped boulders into the water to create artificial pools. They planted trees along the banks. They tried to manually recreate the natural bends that had been removed. Some of it helped. Most of it didn't last. The river kept degrading, and the costs kept climbing. Then a small group of conservationists had an idea that the government didn't immediately support. In fact, when they first proposed it, several officials pushed back hard because what they were suggesting hadn't been done in Scotland in over 4 centuries. The idea was simple: bring the beavers back. Eurasian beavers had once lived across the whole of Britain. They built dams, flooded meadows, created wetlands. They were, in the language of ecology, a keystone species. Remove them, and entire ecosystems collapse, which is exactly what happened. By the 16th century, hunters had wiped them out completely, trapped for their fur, killed for their scent glands, which were believed at the time to have medicinal value. Gone for over 400 years. And the rivers have been paying the price ever since. The conservationists who proposed the reintroduction weren't amateurs. Paul Ramsey, a landowner and wildlife advocate in Perthshire, had been studying beaver ecology for years. She believed, based on documented cases across Europe, that beavers could do what the machines couldn't, but the government wasn't ready. Farmers near the river were nervous. They'd heard stories from Norway and Bavaria. Beavers flooding field, destroying crops, blocking drainage ditches. The opposition was loud and organized, and for a while, it worked. The official reintroduction program stalled in paperwork, committees, reviews, environmental assessments. Years passed. The river kept declining. Then something unexpected happened. In 2001, beavers were spotted in the wild near the river Taynot, released by scientists. Not part of any government program, just there. Nobody knew where they came from. Escaped from private collections, most likely, but they were breeding, and they had already started building. The government hadn't approved anything, and the beavers hadn't asked for permission. The Scottish government had a problem. Wild beavers were living in the River Tay, and nobody had authorized it. Some officials wanted them removed immediately. Trapped, relocated, Ghania species reintroduction without government approval was technically illegal under wildlife legislation, but removing them wasn't simple either. By 2007, the population had grown. Estimates suggested around 150 beavers. Living across the Tay, catchment area, something else was happening. Something the removal arguments hadn't accounted for. The river was changing. Dr. Ramsey and his team had been quietly monitoring the areas where the beavers were most active. What they documented was extraordinary in places where beavers had built dams. The water table had risen, dried-out channels had refilled. Peat bogs that had been shrinking for decades were retaining moisture again in salmon. In specific stretches near beaver activity, juvenile salmon counts were increasing. Not because anyone planted them, not because of any intervention. Just because the habitat had improved enough for the fish to do what they naturally do. The data was undeniable, but here's where the story takes a turn. Because not everyone was celebrating. Several farmers along the Tay reported flooded fields. One farmer near Aberfeldy watched a drainage system had maintained for 30 years get blocked by a beaver dam. In under a week, his entire lower field went underwater. He was furious, and he wasn't alone. A group of landowners formally demanded government action. The pressure was building from both sides now, and the government had to make a decision. That would set a precedent for the entire country. What they decided surprised almost everyone. In 2008, the Scottish government made its decision. They wouldn't remove the beavers. Instead, they launched an official trial reintroduction at Knapdale Forest in Argyll. 11 beavers, brought from Bavaria, were released under strict scientific monitoring. It was the first formally sanctioned mammal reintroduction in British history. But here's what most people don't know. While the official trial was being celebrated in the press, the Tay beavers were still technically illegal. The government hadn't granted them protected status, which meant they could still be removed or worse. And some landowners knew it. Reports emerged of beavers being found dead along the Tay shot. No investigation ever produced a conviction. But the conservationists monitoring the population knew what was happening. The tension between wildlife advocates and landowners wasn't theoretical anymore. It was playing out in the dark, along riverbanks in the early hours of the morning. Meanwhile, the data from Knapdale was coming in, and it was remarkable. Within 3 years, the 11 Bavarian beavers had built 17 dams across the forest site. Water retention in the area increased significantly. Insect populations surged. Otters were spotted in zones where they hadn't been recorded in years. The forest floor, once dry and compacted, was returning to something ancient. Something that hadn't existed there in living memory. But the most shocking result wasn't in the water. It wasn't in the fish counts. It was in a number that nobody had predicted going in. A number that quietly changed the entire argument about what beavers are actually worth to the Scottish economy. The number was 18 pounds million. That's what researchers calculated beaver activity was saving Scotland. In flood management costs alone every year, not through engineering, not through government contracts. Through dams built by animals using nothing but wood, mud, and instinct. The beaver wetlands were absorbing floodwater that would otherwise have torn through farmland downstream. The same farmers who had opposed the reintroduction were, in some cases, being protected by it, without knowing it, without asking for it. In 2019, after years of review, legal challenges, and fierce debate, the Scottish government made a historic announcement. The Eurasian beaver was granted protected species status in Scotland, the first time a locally extinct mammal had been formally reintroduced and legally protected in the entire history of the United Kingdom. The Tay beavers, once illegal, once quietly hunted in the dark, were now protected by law. And the population kept growing today. There are estimated to be over 1,000 beavers living wild across Scotland, the river that machines couldn't fix. Is measurably healthier salmon are returning to stretches of the Tay that hadn't seen breeding populations in decades, and the engineers who once moved boulders by hand to simulate what a healthy river looks like now studied beaver dams to understand how to do it better. They're the lesson buried in all of this. Sometimes the most powerful restoration tool on Earth isn't a machine, it's the animal that was there before the machine existed. If stories like this one stay with you, there are more waiting. Hit subscribe, and we'll keep telling them.